Hi, relationship violence class. I'm really excited about our week coming up. That is, I think, a week that everyone has been looking forward to. It's our week where we focus on male victims and also same-sex relationships. So we have two articles that specifically talk about male victims that really kind of focus on men in heterosexual relationships. So the perpetrator is a woman. And then we have two articles that talk about same-sex abusive relationships. The first article is from 2009. It's by Alan Collinson. And this is a qualitative article in which the researcher who wrote the article analyzes a diary or a journal of one man who was in a heterosexual abusive relationship. His wife abused him. It's an interesting article because it talks about a man who is middle class. He was in this relationship for over 20 years. They had children together. So he's not the stereotype of what a lot of people think of as the victim of relationship violence. So it's interesting to read his journal. One thing that's cool about this article is they point out when he wrote the journal, he wrote it in third person. So he writes things like, he gets hit by his wife instead of I got hit by my wife. And so it's a way for him to kind of distance what's happening. It's almost like a dissociation from what he's experiencing. So I think you'll find that article really interesting from a psychological point of view. The next article that's specifically about male victims in heterosexual relationships is our only quantitative study for next week. And this was a study done with college students who basically just talked about their thoughts toward people who would be male victims in a heterosexual relationship. So of the people who participated in the study, they were all in college. It was about half men and half women. And the authors had three hypotheses. The first was that all of the participants would have more stigma toward male victims. So in other words, more negative attitudes about male victims in heterosexual relationships as compared to female victims in heterosexual relationships. They also hypothesized that male victims would be less likely to say that any particular act counted as abuse if it were coming from a woman. So if a woman hits you, it's not as abusive as if a man hits you, basically. And then they also thought that the male participants said, if I did experience these things, I would probably think that it wasn't that big of a deal and I wouldn't seek help. So it talks about the stigma and the lack of resources that male victims have when they're coming from abusive heterosexual relationships. The other two articles are both about same-sex violence. So this first one is another qualitative study. It interviews 25 men who were in abusive relationships with another man. And this article talks about themes for why they stayed despite the abuse. So it parallels articles that we read earlier in the last 2 weeks about why women stayed. And it's interesting to compare the answers for what women say versus what men say, especially men from gay relationships. The last article that you're going to read is by West in 1998, and this discusses both gay male and gay female relationships, so gay male and lesbian relationships, and it kind of compares them in terms of the statistics that we know. Now, this was written in 1998, so keep in mind that there have been 20 years of research since then, but it's an interesting kind of starting point, and it talks about how there are some dynamics in same-sex relationships that aren't in heterosexual relationships that still might affect the dynamics of how you deal with abuse. So for example, one additional type of emotional abuse that you might experience in a same-sex relationship would be if your partner threatens to out you in ways or to people for whom you don't want to be out as gay. So it's interesting to kind of compare what sorts of abuse might be happening in same-sex relationships that don't happen in heterosexual relationships. This article talks about predictors of same-sex perpetrators of relationship abuse. Most of those are going to be similar to what we've already seen, so things like alcohol abuse, growing up in a family of origin that was violent. But there will be a couple of new ideas. And then it also talks about particular barriers for same-sex victims. How can same-sex victims get out? And are the barriers different or the same compared to heterosexual victims? And then also specific treatment recommendations for victims of same-sex abuse. So I think that these articles are really interesting. I think it'll be one of our kind of more engaging weeks, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks very much, and let me know if you have questions as always.